The Wilds of Patagonia, by Carl Skottsberg, published in London, by Edward Arnold, year 1911. A narrative of the Swedish expedition to Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego, and the Falkland Islands in 1907 to 1909, by Carl Skottsberg, to Sir Joseph Dalton Hooker, the pioneer and the master. This volume is dedicated in profound admiration. Preface. When, in January 1904, I had returned from taking part in the Swedish Antarctic expedition, and had begun to work out my notes and collections, it happened to me, as it has happened to so many others before, that every now and then questions cropped up which, for want of material, had to be left unanswered. Gradually also quite new problems presented themselves, and the thought of returning once more to some of the countries I had visited soon arose. One of my companions from the Antarctic, Dr. J.G. Anderson, had just the same experience, but was kept in Sweden by his work as director of the Geological Survey. Without knowing of my scheme, he had got two of our common friends, T. Halley and P. Quensel, interested in our old field of operations in South America, and one day, as we happened to be speaking of it, we considered the possibility of planning a modest expedition, principally for geological and botanical purposes. With a geological survey were connected a number of geographical problems, such as the changes of the land after the Ice Age, the formation and true nature of the Patagonian channels, the origin of the transverse Andine valleys, PGV, the influence of geology and plant geography on the landscape, and c. The algological investigations would also lead to the formation of zoological collections, and besides, we thought that in the Patagonian channels we should have opportunities of making ethnographic studies. In order to discuss our plans, I arranged with Quensel and Halley that they should meet me in Stockholm at the Geological Survey office, and one evening was born the enterprise, afterwards called the Swedish Magellanic Expedition, of which the author consented to undertake the leadership, the members being Carl Skottsberg, born 1880, DSc. Lecturer at the University of Uppsala, Percy D. Quensel, born 1881, BSc. Now Dr. Uppsala, and Thor G. Halley, born 1884, BSc. Now Dr. Stockholm. I devoted myself to botanical work, but also made most of the insignificant zoological collections. The speciality of Mr. Halley was the survey of fossiliferous deposits, and as a clever bryologist, he assisted me in gathering mosses and other cryptogams. Mr. Quensel was mainly occupied with studies of the eruptive rocks, the origin of the Andes and the phenomena of glaciation. On many occasions the two geologists collaborated, but it is one thing to make up one's mind to go to South America, another to get money for such a purpose. The expedition cost about 23,000 Swedish crowns, PGX, 1,280 pounds, and thanks to several funds, scientific societies and private persons, we procured the necessary money without great difficulty. Many useful articles in our equipment were presented to us, and the Swedish Johnson Line in Stockholm gave us a free passage on its steamers to and from Buenos Aires. To all those who assisted us, I have tried to express our gratitude in the preface to the Swedish edition of this book, and have explained how it would have been absolutely impossible to make a journey which lasted nearly 2 years at such small expense, had it not been for the unparalleled generosity shown by Argentina and more especially by Chile. Not that the Argentine government was less interested, but we spent most of the time in Chile. I need not repeat this, nor my sincere thanks to the representatives of Sweden. There is, however, one thing that I want specially to mention on the occasion of my book being laid before English readers. We spent part of the time in a British colony, the Falkland Islands, where His Excellency the Governor, Mr. W. L. Allardyce, CMG, and Mrs. Allardyce, both deeply interested in scientific work in general as also in our personal welfare, did all they could to promote our success. We are also greatly indebted to the Falkland Islands Company Limited, to its director in London, Mr. F. E. Cobb, as well as to its representatives in Port Stanley, Mr. W. Harding, Mr. W. C. Girling and Lieutenant Colonel A. Reed, DSO, no longer in the PGX company's service. We also owe very much to numerous sheep farmers, Mr. Allen of Darwin, Messrs. Benny of Saunders Island, Mr. Bertrand of Roy Cove, Drive Bolus, now in Punta Arenas, then in Fox Bay, Mr. Felton of West Point Island, Dr. Foley, of Darwin, Mr. Matthews of Port Howard, Mr. Miller of Hill Cove, Mr. Pack of Port Louis, and many others, too numerous to mention. In Chile as well as in Argentina we met and were assisted by a great number of English people. We made good friends wherever we came, and learnt to admire the English nation as the great civilizing power of the world. It may not be considered unnecessary to mention that during the whole journey under most trying conditions, I and my comrades remained the same good friends as we had been on leaving Sweden. Nothing is so well calculated to try friendship as a wild life away from culture and from other people. In this case, friendship certainly stood the test. Chapter 1. The Coasts of the Falkland Islands. The Swedish steamer Princess Ingeborg left Gothenburg on September 10, 1907. Wind and sea favored us, and, after a most agreeable passage, which came like a strengthening, refreshing rest after all the work of the preceding months, we arrived in Buenos Aires on October 7th. The Swedish minister, Mr. O'Gildian, gave us a hearty welcome, and informed us that the Argentine Republic had generously granted us the help we had applied for. We had ample time to get a glimpse of the surrounding country, but naturally preferred to confine our attention chiefly to the scientific centers, to La Plata, Buenos Aires, and Córdoba, where people always showed themselves interested in our enterprise and helped us to make a good start. In Montevideo, the Swedish consul, Mr. Rogberg, met us, and after a short stay, which we thoroughly enjoyed, we began our voyage on the PSNC liner Oravia. The big steamer made its way over a calm and friendly sea that lay glittering in the bright sunshine. For a couple of days we carried the spring of favored Uruguay with us, but on the very morning when we expected to get our first glimpse of the Falklands, a chill fog slowly descended over the waters, and anxious passengers, PG2, tried in vain to get a sight of land. All at once, close by, the brown and yellow, storm-beaten coast loomed up out of the heavy mist, and through furious squalls and a deluge of rain the Oravia steered between the narrows and anchored in the spacious, natural harbor of Stanley. The first person to greet us was one of the staff of the Falkland Islands Company, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Reed, DSO, who had served with the CIVs during the last South African War. We shall always remember him as one of the best friends our expedition met on its long journey. Presently the acting Swedish consul, Mr. Gerling, arrived on board, and soon afterwards we found ourselves comfortably seated at afternoon tea in our new quarters. Once more the smoke from the Falkland peat fire filled my nostrils, recalling to memory my old acquaintance with this peculiar land and its inhabitants, an acquaintance that I was now to revive and to increase. We said goodbye to Mr. Quenzel for some time, as he was going straight on to Punta Arenas, in order to make an expedition into the interior of South Patagonia. The Falkland group extends from S-lat, 51 degrees to 52 degrees 30, and from long, 57 degrees 40 feet to 61 degrees 25 W, and consists of 2 large and a very great number of small islands, which form a regular barrier against the ocean waves. The coastline is exceedingly broken. Long, narrow, and winding creeks penetrate far into the country, marking the course, as there are many proofs to show, of old valleys now submerged under the level of the sea. On the east coast of East Falkland is situated the PG3 little town of Port Stanley, with about 1,000 inhabitants. Along the south shore of the harbor and on the slope of a low ridge, which shuts out the view of the ocean towards the south, long rows of houses are erected, for the most part small cottages built of wood. They leave a very homely impression, as their occupants have tried to transform their porches into small conservatories, where the eye rests on bright colors, which the soil itself absolutely refuses to reproduce. Some buildings attracted our attention more than the rest. In the far west end, there is a conglomeration of houses, together constituting the government house, the residence of His Excellency the Governor. Mr. W. L. Allardyce, CMG, now holds this position. He is a man warmly interested in the material as well as the spiritual welfare of his colony, and we fully recognized his appreciation of our scientific work, which he tried to promote as far as lay in his power. He rules a vast dominion. Some years ago Great Britain painted red another large section of the globe, the colony now including, besides the Falklands and South Georgia, the South Sandwich Islands, South Orkneys, South Shetlands, and Graham's Land. The result of this spread of British power was far-reaching. The whaling industry having languished in Norway, energetic whalers started in the South Atlantic and Antarctic seas, and numerous vessels hunt there every summer and pay their tribute to the Falkland government, which has thus increased its revenue. At the other end of the town lies a long white building, representing the second power here, not the people, PG4, but the FIC, the Falkland Islands Company, a mighty institution. Only with the assistance of its chief on the spot, Mr. W. Harding, were we able to carry out our investigations in the most interesting part of East Falkland, or to visit the Western Islands, where the company's small schooners are the sole available means of communication. The third state power, the press, is closely connected with the church, as the name of the only paper, The Falkland Islands magazine and church paper, issued once a month, bears incontestable witness. Close to the beach rises the cathedral, a proud title which is born as a matter of fact by a little stone chapel. The city of Stanley is the headquarters of a bishop, but as his diocese includes almost the whole of South America, the islanders do not enjoy his presence for more than a fortnight in the year. Naturally, the inhabitants are too numerous to be of one faith. Both Roman Catholics and Baptists have their own churches, but the relations between the different sects seem to be most amicable, at least if one dare judge from a certain little scene that has remained in my memory. A welcome was arranged for the bishop, and on that occasion the faithful gave free scope to their talents, and a Roman Catholic, whose intentions were excellent if his voice was poor, appeared on the stage and sang a little song in honor of his lordship. It is remarkable and almost touching to observe with what faithfulness the 2,300 Falklanders cling to the habits of the old country, from the parlor with its polished stove, the china cats on the mantelpiece, PG5, the breakfast of eggs and bacon, to the bedrooms without a fire. When you have drawn the curtains and lit the lamp, you can believe that you are in a snug little house in a small English town. But take a look out of doors, and you generally meet a howling west wind, a cold rain beats on your face, and whichever way you turn you always see the same dreary, desolate landscape. You must certainly be born in Northern Europe, or you would lose heart in this forlorn corner of the world. The center of Stanley society is Government House, and picnics, dances, and dinners follow hard upon each other. I can assure you that there is plenty to amuse you in Stanley. That is, if you have the privilege of being admitted to the upper 10, without 1,000. Life is much less easy for those who have been stranded on this inhospitable coast, not of their own free will, but by a cruel fate. Generally they seek refuge in one of the 6 small hotels, where statistics show the consumption of whiskey to be considerable. Nevertheless, the police can go to bed early in Port Stanley, where the peace is seldom broken. Communication with England is kept up by the PSNC steamers, which touch once a month on their outward and once on their homeward passage from the west coast of Chile and Punta Arenas. Their visits put new life into the little town. Boxes and parcels bring dainties and the latest fashions. The post office is besieged. Strangers come ashore to have a look round and to buy illustrated postcards. But the huge black hull soon disappears, and the town sinks back into PG6, its usual quiet. Now and again a sailing vessel happens to come inside the harbor. Generally it is some damaged craft, which then often loses its freedom. To repair it is too expensive, and so the FIC buys the whole thing, and the port makes an addition to its fine collection of old hulks. It is a day in early spring on the hills near Port Stanley. The heath stretches yellow and dreary, the withered grass is beaten to the ground by an irritating wind, from which you can find hardly any shelter. Gray and broken quartzite ridges run through brown peat bogs. Nowhere is there a tree visible, scarcely a bush is to be seen. The islands are absolutely destitute of timber, and the inhabitants use dried peat for fuel. Here and there a little white flower has ventured to peep out of the dead grass and stands shivering in the cold. Let us climb one of the low peaks that rise a little above the surroundings, and get a more extensive but not a finer view. Everywhere we see the same sad picture: low ridges, undulating plains, winding brooks, where boggy ground gleams with its dangerous bright green color as if to warn the horsemen. Here and there glitters some little shallow pond. A frightened flock of sheep hurries off, screaming seagulls hasten past, slowly the turkey buzzard soars away. Such is often the impression you get on a short visit to the Falklands, especially during the unfavorable season, and even a bright sunny day can hardly give this scenery real charm. Grand it could never be without the assistance of the sea, for here as in so many other PG7 places in the world the roaring surf bestows a wild beauty upon the black, inhospitable cliffs. We spent the first few days making excursions in the neighborhood of the town, and Mr. Halley went as far as Port Louis. Later on I shall say more about that place. Before we leave this part of the island, however, let me conduct the reader to a point not far from the city, the lighthouse near Cape Pembroke, a spot that has always possessed a strong attraction for me since the first time I visited it. One can get there overland or by boat. Let us choose the latter way this time. The landing is interesting enough. The shore is rocky, and we steer through foaming breakers towards a narrow gap. Every eye is watchful, every hand ready. Across the opening a heavy chain is stretched, and when the boat passes underneath a line is flung round it, the end being secured round the middle bench of the boat. At the same moment another line is thrown ashore, where a man stands ready to receive it. It is indeed required. The surf rolling in hurls the boat forward with creaking timbers and then draws it back again, so that the ropes are strained like the strings of a violin. If you miss the chain, your boat may be crushed against the cliffs. This, indeed, has happened, but I am glad to say that I managed to get ashore without adventure, and at once went to see that good fellow, the lighthouse keeper, who was glad enough to get some company in his loneliness. In truth, one would have to seek far to find a more desolate place than this. After the destruction of the tussock grass, the whole promontory was changed into a vast field of drifting sand. Desolation, pg 8, whispers in the whistling sand that beats on the windows. Desolation howls in the gale round the black, jagged rocks. Desolation thunders in the everlasting breakers. But one gets a certain feeling of security when within. The light carries on its silent struggle with danger and darkness, and the sand rattles incessantly against the iron walls. The magnificent lamp is of the lux pattern, and a good old primus is used to heat the burner. The vigorous keeper, my friend Mr. Pierce, nurses his light as if it were a baby. Every part of its mechanism is perfectly clean and shining, and he tells you with barely concealed pride that the electric flash from the mail steamer is but poor stuff in comparison with his own light. He listens to every word when you tell him of foreign countries, and he himself has rather specialized on the Antarctic regions, ever since the time when the leader of the Scottish National Antarctic Expedition, Mr. Bruce, was his guest. When the sun rose, I found plenty to do. At low tide, there is a precious world spread out on the dry rocks or in half-emptied pools. The rocks are covered with seaweeds, green and reddish-brown, of all shades and colors. Half dead from thirst, they await the arrival of another tide which shall restore them to life. In the small ponds or basins a variegated company dwells. A carpet of rose-colored calcareous algae covers the rock, and here and there are patches of other seaweeds, from the largest blade-like variety to the small, elegant bushes, displaying the brightest scarlet or crimson, purple or violet coloring. And, pg9, what a life there is in these recesses! The most splendid actiniae, sea anemones, as they are often called, stretch their hundreds of arms. An innumerable horde of little crustacea dance round and round, wild with delight. Beautiful shells rest lazily in safe nooks and crannies, while here and there little fishes that have got left behind when the water receded dart to and fro in their anxiety to escape their temporary prison. Deeper down, the gigantic Dervilias roll their bodies in the foam. They are some feet broad and many feet long, and fastened on the bare rock by means of a short thick stalk, and a disc just like a horse's hoof. Some of them farther out in the heaviest surf are of another shape. They are divided into long, cylindrical segments, which writhe like serpents in eternal struggle with the full force of the sea. Below lies the forest of the ocean. It is formed of another brown kelp, the Arborus lessonia, with trunks many feet long and as thick as a man's thigh, carrying a crown of large yellowish-brown leaves, just peeping above the water, and slowly swinging forwards and backwards in the waves. It is a magnificent sight, this submerged forest, with its rich bower, where fishes and all sorts of marine animals swim, while a whole world of plants and creatures thrive in its shadows. A pair of ducks glide along chattering and quacking, followed by 5 dear little ducklings, who make their voyage of discovery to the promised land under their parents' wise direction. Clear as crystal is the water, and the temptation to have a bathe is very strong indeed. How one would enjoy climbing in those curious trees! No fear that the branches may give pg10 way, for they are made to carry a greater weight than ours. What a pity that the water is so cold, but a few degrees above freezing point. Finally, let us gaze round farther away over the water. There is a yellow or brownish band that extends along the shores as far as we can see. It is one of the most famous plants in the world, Macrocystis, nature's own beacon. One might say that as a rule there is no dangerous reef where that giant seaweed does not grow to warn the sailor. And how beautiful it is, with its graceful branches softly moving to and fro with the swell of the ocean. We landed in Port Stanley on October 26th, and it was long before we found a schooner bound for an extended trip. But finally, on November 18th, the Lafonia hoisted the Swedish as well as the English colors and steered out to the open, to work her way westward round the north coast. The outlines of the country are monotonous. Only here and there a round hill rises above the neighboring plains, always making a good landmark. The land has disappeared. We are outside the Falkland Sound, which separates the 2 large islands, and by we get sight of the 3 hummocks on Pebble Island. We steer clear of the thousands of dangerous reefs, and continue westward with a fresh NNW and a heavy sea that washes our little craft from bow to stern. The good wind keeps fresh, and we pass the straits at Carcass Island, cross Byron Sound, and have the good luck to reach West Point Passage with the rising tide, which allows us to get through this difficult, PG-11, channel. The tidal currents on the Falkland coast are perhaps the greatest danger to sailing vessels. They swirl through those innumerable narrow channels which one is bound to get through, with the strength of up to 6 or 7 knots. A look on a chart is sufficient to persuade us that we are navigating a very disagreeable coast. Hardly a year passes without one or more of the small Stanley schooners leaving the town, never to return. The scenery has changed a little. It is desolate as before, but grander. The cliffs run down to the sea sheer as though cut by a knife, while heavy breakers throw their foam high above them. On the inside of the steep Rabbit Island, in King George's Bay, the Lafonia anchored, but the next morning we continued our journey across the Gulf, through the critical East Passage, and then through a long and winding sound to the entrance of Port Philomel. Here we encountered a gale lasting 4.5 days. With the prevailing southwest wind, it was out of the question to get away. We were anchored only a few hundred yards off the land, but the wind was so strong that it was with difficulty we managed to get ashore. We wanted to march across the peninsula, in order to get acquainted with one of the more inaccessible parts of the island. It is a heavy job to march in the Falkland camp, up and down all the time, through ravines, stone runs, or swamps. Our fame as foot Indians is not small in Port Stanley, and we begin to understand why the people regard a long walk in the camp as something rather eccentric. PG-12. We had just climbed a steep ridge when I thought I smelt something familiar, and stopped to trace it. No doubt it must be cattle, which seemed peculiar so far away from any settlement. But the smell got stronger, and from the top of the ridge we caught sight of the cause. Some of the scanty remnants of the wild cattle, a small herd of 20, amongst them some calves and 2 bulls. They at once caught sight of us, cows and calves fell back, and the bulls stopped in front of them, ready for action. But we did not want to come any closer, and thought it better to stop where we were and watch them. They were 2 imposing beasts, very wild-looking, with enormous horns, long coarse hair, and a tail with a tuft of respectable dimensions. Some minutes passed, they slowly retired, but turned round at every second step in order to send us a friendly look. We picked our way cautiously, for we did not wish to run across them unawares, in which case they would have charged us immediately. And as we were on foot and without any other arms than a knife to dig up plants with, we were not exactly prepared to enter on a struggle. When the colonists in the middle of the last century came to the islands, these were well stocked with wild cattle, and we were told the most exciting tales of hunting them with lasso and knife, but without firearms. That was grand sport, said an old gentleman pioneer. I do not doubt this, but horse and rider lost their lives in more than one encounter. Finally the wind changed, and the question of how to get out through the narrow passage arose. The current, PG-13, here, which makes about 7 knots, played with the ship for a while, but eventually we came safely through it, and anchored again on the north side of Fox Island. Here, however, no foxes live, the name being all that is left of the Falkland fox. He was too tame, that was his worst fault. An old farmer on the settlement in front of the island told me that he killed his last fox in 1873, and shortly afterwards the animal was extinct. This is a pity, as the species Canis falklandicus has now disappeared forever. The glass had fallen for a second time, but our anxiety to visit Fox Island was so great that not even the threatening Falkland weather could keep us back. My intention was to look at and photograph the largest land plant of all Falkland, the Veronica elliptica, or Falkland box, which seems to reach its greatest dimensions just here. I had just exposed a couple of plates when the first squall came with a deluge of rain. We tried to get on board while there was time, and made full speed for the landing place. At 1 p.m. we were back there. But it was too late. A fresh gale was blowing in the harbor. Far out the Lafonia lay, rocking on her cables. I shall never forget the 6 hours we spent on shore without shelter. At 7 o'clock the wind fell a little, enough to let the crew lower the lifeboat and come to fetch us. Captain Osborne himself held the tiller, and though 6 oars worked with the full strength of muscular arms, they nearly failed to reach us. We did not regret that place very much when we weighed anchor to visit the outlying islands, Weddell, Beaver, and New Islands, each of which is a small sheep farm. I can hardly imagine people more shut out of the world than their inhabitants. Years pass without their seeing any strangers save the crew of the little schooner that comes once or twice a year to bring provisions and carry away the wool. Here one has to economize, for if one runs short of an article one remains so, though there is always a spare supply of important things. We met several full-grown persons who were born there and had never left the place, and who thought Port Stanley something marvelous. This explains the queer behavior of a young lady of 18 who ran away and hid herself when we came, thus providing us with an altogether new experience. No scientists had visited the outlying islands, and people had told us many remarkable things about the geology as well as the botany of the place. But though these are typical of all parts of the West Falklands, it was nevertheless worth something to be able to reduce such rumors to their proper proportions. It will be easily understood that it must be very difficult even on the greater and richer settlements to reproduce the features of a snug and sheltered home, where the natural conditions are so unpromising as on the Falklands. When we steered into the narrow creek on the north side of King George's Bay, called Roy Cove, we were quite astonished to find that place well worthy of being called habitable. The hills are rather picturesque, and the comfortable little houses, embedded in gorse hedges now in full bloom, left a very favorable impression. In the creek we made a discovery that caused us all to stare with amazement. Here lay a large iron vessel, and we could not possibly imagine what business it could have in such a remote corner. But the enigma was soon solved. The French bark Duc d'Aumale had sprung a leak on the high seas, on her way to the west coast of America, and though in another couple of hours she would have gone down to a certainty, at the very last moment her captain managed to bring her into Roy Cove with the aid of a chart. The ocean here has many tales to tell. Almost every point or reef is connected with some shipwreck. Innumerable are the ships that destruction has overtaken on this coast, where no beacon or light announces danger. We had got much information about West Point Island, and had resolved to make a fairly long stay there if possible. When we anchored at the settlement on the island, Clifton Station, on December 7th, there was no need for the owners, Mr. Arthur Felton, persuasions. We were only too glad to abandon the Lafonia, which continued her voyage, and to settle on shore. Mr. Felton approximates very nearly to my ideal of a man, ready to enjoy life and civilization when there is a chance. He nevertheless lives in complete harmony with the wild camp life. Interested in his work, he tries all sorts of grasses for his sheep, but is also, an exception to the general rule, intensely fond of nature itself and gifted with such a remarkable capacity for observation that many a naturalist by profession has reason to envy him. He knows every beast or plant on his island, he loves and nurses them, quite convinced that the human race can live at its ease without depriving living things which do him no harm of any chance of existence. I have never met anybody but him who tries to save one of the Falklands' finest adornments, the giant tussock grass, Poa flagelata, which is nearly extinct wherever there are sheep, much to the detriment of the coast's appearance. Mr. Felton expressed the deepest interest in our work, and spared neither trouble nor time to prove it. He took the greatest care that we should get the best possible results from our visit to his kingdom, which we left after a week, not without considerable regret, joining unanimously in the praise that has been showered upon West Point Island. An excursion across the island to the cliff with its steep rocks and crevices is well worth making. Large grass bogs cover the slopes, where molly mocks, Diamedia chlorinca, have their rookery. There are eggs in the nests, one of which is more than sufficient as a breakfast dish. To obtain these one must lift the hen away by force. Quick as lightning she turns her head, opens her long beak, and shuts it with a click, and finally tries to turn her crop inside out and sprinkle the half-digested, stinking food on the intruders. On the slope above the albatross's dominion is a penguin rookery, where the visitor may like to stop and look at those, perhaps the most comical of all, animals chattering and screaming among the pink-colored guano. They belong to the rockhoppers, Eudiptes chrysocum, and are dark blue and white, with a number of yellow feathers on the side of the head. The penguins depend completely on the water, and those of West Point have a hard climb of over 100 yards to the surf, where they tumble about in a most neck-breaking fashion. Thousands and thousands of small penguin feet have dug deep marks in the hard rocks, climbing up and down, century after century. Quite struck with the uncommon sight, we sat still to watch them, as they emerged out of the breakers, jumped ashore, and started their fatiguing climb up the cliff, carefully putting their little claws where their ancestors through innumerable ages have put theirs, the road being so narrow and difficult that the penguins willy-nilly must follow in each other's footsteps. As I have already mentioned, the Falklands have no indigenous arborous vegetation. This was not always so. I am not alluding to distant geological periods with a plant world quite different from that of our era, for even in the epoch in which we lived there were forests in the Falklands. With the deterioration of the climate that gave rise to the Ice Age, large tracts of austral South America became covered with a mighty ice cap. Hundreds of plants and animals died out or migrated to the north. This did not take place on the Falklands. They experienced the hard time in another manner, and there is no trace of a glaciation. The weather became more chilly and wet, and the ground was so saturated with moisture that it began to slide away downhill, carrying with it blocks of all sizes and shapes. The forest disappeared, and certainly a number of animals and plants. When the conditions grew better, the moving soil came to a standstill. The finer material, sand and clay, was washed away into the sea, but heaps of blocks are left in evidence of past times. These are the famous stone runs or stone rivers that will always rouse the interest of the stranger as well as the islander. Everywhere these peculiar formations are met with, forming a network on the slopes of the valleys, are long gray streams of stones at the bottom. They constitute an obstacle to traffic quite as insurmountable as the swamps. We had no idea before our arrival at West Point that there had been forests on the islands during a period, geologically speaking, so near our own. The rumor of heavy logs found in the ground had helped to bring us there, though we had been disposed to attribute the find to common driftwood. There was no doubt, however, that this was the remains of an old forest of needle trees, well covered by the old sliding soil, and we had been lucky enough to make a discovery of the greatest interest. Long afterwards, the kelper spoke of nothing but the old forest. The consciousness of the simple fact that there had grown big trees on his island seemed to strengthen his pride. Our time was up, the signal fire flared, and on the main, a man with horses expected us. We were to experience a new phase of Falkland life on horseback. Chapter 2. Riding through the Falklands. On horseback we slowly advanced along the rough, stony northern slope of the long peninsula. Several hours passed. We came close to the house of our guide, an old, taciturn Scotsman, and stopped for a while at his invitation. At once his talkative wife, attired in her best Sunday clothes, served us with whatever the Falklands can produce of delicious dishes, and we were then ready for a fresh start. What would this country be like without horses? All people ride, and ride well. It is the only way of traveling in the camp, where roads are unknown. At first we found it marvelous with what agility the horses trotted along, climbing the steepest slopes, and struggling down places that appeared perilous enough to the inexperienced rider. Sometimes there is danger, but soon one does not think of it, for in 99 cases out of 100 the horse is equal to the occasion. Hour after hour one rides in the comfortable wooden saddle without getting tired, thanks to the soft sheepskin. The wretched ground forces one to walk or trot, and the patches where one can gallop one's horse are easily counted. Our goal for the day was Hill Cove, one of the finest settlements. With its numerous, friendly-looking buildings and its beautiful gardens, it produces an PG-20, uncommonly agreeable impression. Widely known as the Forest of Hill Cove, in a little depression a number of northern trees are planted, mostly Scotch fir, which, being well sheltered, seem to thrive very well. It was pure delight once more to hear the wind soughing in the heads of the trees. We were received with the usual hospitality, and were provided with horses and guides, in spite of its being the busiest time of the year, when the sheep shearing was on. Flock after flock was driven into a paddock, and from there to the shed, where the thick white wool was cut with clicking scissors, until one almost thought one heard the resultant heavy golden sovereigns jingling on the floor. Sheep farming is a profitable industry, and many of the farmers are able every year to exchange the winter in the Falklands for England's summer. The total stock on a settlement is divided into flocks, each watched by a shepherd, often a Scotsman. He lives out in the camp, sometimes far away from other human dwellings, in his snug little house, with his family, his dogs, and with good pay. He can keep a couple of cows, grow potatoes and cabbages, and use as much peat as he needs for fuel. Certainly his life is hard enough in summertime. There is lamb marking, shearing, and finally dipping, and no thought of a rest. But with winter comes an easier life, when he works with his horse gear or reads sixpenny books and illustrated papers. Now and then he takes a ride round his district, gives an eye to the sheep, and sees that fences and gates are in order. We made many friends amongst PG-21, the shepherds, who brought us safe through the thousands of dangerous bogs, offered us a seat at their table, and gave us a bed without any thought of payment. The land south of Hill Cove is mountainous, and a few hours' ride brings us to the foot of Mount Adam, 2,315 feet high, the highest mountain in the islands, and regarded as a very Mont Blanc by the islanders. As no scientific observations had been made there, we resolved to make an ascent. From Hill Cove we had to cross several ravines, but were able to ride up to the summit itself without inconvenience. Here we found the face of nature very different from what we had been accustomed to. From the mountain top we enjoyed a splendid view over half West Falkland, suggestive of alpine landscape, certainly very tame, but still adorned by small snow patches, a number of glittering mountain lakes, and a few alpine plants. Here were no sheep, but an expanse of virgin ground decked by the hand of nature. And the weather, this wonderful everlasting April, was very gracious to us all day along. We did not intend to stay long in Hill Cove, for the schooner which was to take us to Stanley might be expected in Fox Bay before Christmas, and we had several interesting places to visit. Our start, however, was almost too precipitate. One of the brothers, Benny from Saunders Island, came to the farm, and in spite of not having more than an hour to make ourselves ready, we made up our minds to accept his invitation and visit his island. We trotted away, a party of 4, in order to reach Rapid Point, where a boat was to meet us before nightfall. But we were indeed deceived. When we reached the beach it was already pitch dark, but horses have cat's eyes, and soon we had a fine signal fire on a hill. After a while the reply flashed forth from the island, but when the boat came it proved too small to take us all, as Hallie and I were not expected. As the tidal currents in the channel are very strong, we could not be sure of being fetched the same night. We were told, however, to wait for a signal, 1 flash meaning a disagreeable ride, 2 a boat journey to the island. The night was very chilly, but we made ourselves as comfortable as possible with a queer camp fire of gigantic dry trunks of seaweed, Lesonia, and Mr. Benny found some tea and sugar in his maletas, valise. Many Spanish words, especially referring to horse gear, are still used in the islands, so we had nothing to complain of. Midnight came, still no message, but at last 2 flashes illumined the darkness, and after a while we heard the longed-for splash of oars. We set off, but as we could hardly see our hands before us, the current took us outside the reef between Rapid Point and the island. The breakers told us the truth, and using all our strength we managed to reach the reef, jumped into the water, and dragged the boat across. Before a neatly laid table and some fat mutton we soon forgot the adventures of the night. Saunders Island is one of the few places on the Falklands to which historical reminiscences are attached. The discovery of the islands took place in 1592, though they may have been sighted even before 1520, but only in 1764 was the first colony founded by the French, who settled in Port Louis, on the East Falklands. The next year the English appeared at Port Egmont, and built their quarters a short distance from the actual settlement. But soon Spaniards from South America cast envious glances at the colony, and as the enemy was superior in numbers the fort at Port Egmont was given up. Old cannonballs are still preserved, and several other relics such as the foundation walls of the fortress, while traces of extensive gardens and ruins of the old settlement are still left. Later on the Spaniards left the place, colonization proceeded once more, but only for a short time, and in 1774 the place was abandoned. We had enjoyed Falkland summer weather for several days, but it was not long before it broke up. We were just on our way back to the mainland in a small yawl when the first squall came on us like lightning, and within half an hour the sea was so heavy that we were forced to turn back and had to cross in a small cutter. The narrow channel looked like a boiling cauldron, as the current ran against wind and sea. Several times the cutter refused to answer the helm, but we managed at last to reach the mainland, where horses were once more awaiting us. The rain poured down, the ground was very difficult, wet and slippery, and progress very slow. We passed the natural ruin of Castle Hill, crossed 5 rivers, of which the last is the main river Wara, the others its tributaries, and reached a shepherd's house at nightfall. Horses from Port Howard met us here, and early the next morning we again found ourselves in the saddle. We wanted to survey the valley of Wara River, which is one of the largest streams in West Falkland. At that time of the year, however, it carried but little water and we could cross without difficulty. We followed the barranca, which became steeper and steeper, necessitating our riding in single file, with the guide in front. Suddenly he stopped and shouted out "Look out here!" Truly we could hardly see any signs of a path. A couple of 100 feet below wound the river, on our left a precipitous wall rose, and the narrow way was barred by huge blocks of stone. For an instant the horses seemed to hesitate, groped among the stones, got a foothold, took 2 or 3 unsteady steps, and scrambled past the obstacle. A slip, and horse and rider would have been precipitated into the river. Rather a nasty place, our man remarked, and neither of us found any reason to contradict him. We followed the river down to the place where the tidal region commences, crossed it once more, struggled a while with the network of a stone run, and turned towards Port Howard, whose interesting natural harbor I would ask the reader to study on the map. Once more we found ourselves in a large and comfortable settlement, where Mr. and Mrs. Matthews gave us a hearty welcome, always ready to put that question to us which we heard so often: what can we do to make it comfortable for you and to help you to attain good scientific results? The bad weather continued. We made our excursions in storm and rain, walking about in oilskins. One day we made an ascent of Mount Maria, one of the highest mountains, and only a little lower than Mount Adam. But as the ground is uncommonly bad, the slope being one extensive network of stone runs, we had to travel on foot. The rain poured down as we climbed along, and suddenly we found ourselves enveloped in a fog so dense and white that the view was shut off in all directions. It was certainly more by good luck than by good judgment that we walked straight on to the little cairn at the summit. Our stay in Port Howard yielded very good results, and with regret we said goodbye to our hosts, jumped into the saddle, and headed for Fox Bay on the south coast. We were accompanied by the mail carrier. After a long and tiresome ride we reached our goal. Here lives the doctor of West Falkland. On the occasion of our visit the position was held by Dr. Bolus, who received us with the utmost courtesy and kindness. This young doctor was a good all-round man, for besides his proper duties he fulfilled those of custom officer, policeman, postmaster, and public registrar. Being a spirited fellow who rides alone by day or night in any weather, he had many tales to tell of hazardous rides, when snow covered the dangerous bogs, how he reached the western seashore, jumped into an ice-clad boat, and struggled through storm and mist to one or other of the outlying islands, where a fellow creature lay wrestling with death. Meanwhile the Lafonia lingered. We had already made ourselves familiar with the thought of celebrating Christmas Eve with Dr. Bolus and his wife. It did not cause any mental struggle, as we could hardly have been better off than in their cozy home, when on the afternoon of December 22nd the schooner entered the narrow creek. It brought us our mail, and, from the consulate in Port Stanley, the news of King Oscar's death. And down here, in a remote corner of the Falklands, 2 blue and yellow flags were hoisted, half-mast, on the doctor's house and on the little schooner. The next morning the Lafonia weighed anchor. The wind was northeasterly, a rather uncommon occurrence, and with some misgivings we regarded the approaching Christmas Day. I believe that we never experienced anything like it. The small schooner rolled incessantly with a hard wind and heavy sea. We ran short of provisions, and there were no possibilities to raise our spirits. Gnawing at the last mutton bones, we arrived in Stanley in the evening of Boxing Day, but found the capital empty. In a deluge of rain horse races took place outside the town, and of course all the inhabitants had placed themselves under their umbrellas. But we stayed at home and ate, quickly but heartily. Thus Christmas passed, and 1907 was soon only a memory. We sat up to see the new year in with some of our English friends, who did all they could to make us feel at home. And warmed by their friendship we almost forgot that we were far away from our homes and everything dear to us. We did not intend to stop long in Stanley, as the time had come to survey East Falkland. We had done but little there, and the most interesting part was still left. As soon as a schooner was ready, Halley went to Port Darwin, in Choiseul Sound. I had to complete my studies in the vicinity of Stanley. The camp reveled in the beauty of summer. Everything in this world is a matter of comparison, and the life on the rocks round the lighthouse once more attracted me. But Halley sent a message telling of great geological discoveries, and on January 14th I went on board the Lafonia, which could thus hoist the Swedish colors alongside of the English once more. We came out through Port Williams all right, and also past the Tussock Islands, where the sea lions lay snoring. From there we had a miserable run, having to beat all the way down, and did not arrive at Darwin until late the next day. The south part of East Falkland, south of Wickham Heights, does not differ much from the rest of the island in appearance. With the exception of a very doubtful find on Speedwell Island, nothing indicated that layers younger than Devonian would occur on the islands. Halley's discovery that the whole south part of East Falkland, generally called Lafonia, belongs to a younger period, viz. the Permo-Carbonian, was thus of great interest, and in several places he made beautiful and valuable collections of the fossilized remains of plants, Glossopteris, which had once spread their shadow over the Falkland soil. Lafonia is owned by the Falkland Islands Company, and about 200,000 sheep graze on the undulating plains. We found here the largest pampas-like spots I ever saw in the islands, and enjoyed being able to travel at a fair speed. Otherwise the camp was more or less the same as usual, the same winding creeks, that appear in the middle of the country when you do not at all expect them, forcing you to make a long detour, the same streams slowly creeping through the treacherous peat, sometimes impassable, and always difficult to cross on horseback. The coast, of course, is as charming as ever with its rich bird life, flocks of many-colored geese, cloifiga, red-legged gulls, Larousse scoresby, flapping shags, and a long row of squeaking waders, and its cliffs with guano and white rocks, sculptured by the waves into fantastic forms and tunnels. Darwin Harbor is the camp center of the FIC. It is the next largest settlement, with about 70 or 80 inhabitants, and boasts of a good store, a school, and also a doctor. When we had crossed Lafonia in all directions, we wanted to pay a visit to the west coast. Several days of heavy rain had soaked the camp and delayed our start, but finally we were able to set out, accompanied by Dr. Foley, who kindly acted as our guide. We soon left the plains and reached the usual broken ground. The wind was biting cold, and now and then a wet squall paid us its attention. Suddenly a long creek appeared. It was Port Sussex. The tide was out, and our horses splashed across cheerfully, making deep imprints in the smooth mud. Carefully they climbed the stony barranca on the other side. As they were not shod, they hated stony places, and peered to right and left in order to see if there was no chance of breaking out. The doctor had pointed out a rock high up on the gray quartzite ridge. That was our landmark. The ascent was troublesome. The ground had become covered by loose peat and the horses began to get tired. On the top of one of the ridges we met with a critical passage, for which the doctor had already prepared us. A place where the pure peat, brown and loose, was exposed. At the edge the horses stopped with firm resolution, and we could read in their faces a, "No, sir, that's enough." We dismounted, grasped the long cabresta, halter strap, and pulled away. Absolute refusal. We pulled each at his end, the horse and I, and the stronger won. Then the lashes hailed down on the back of the insubordinate creature. It took a desperate jump, lay kicking and struggling in the black mud, and finally gained firm ground. We had passed the crest of Wickham Heights, and rode down a series of slopes to San Carlos South, a farm where the doctor was to vaccinate some children. As soon as he was ready, we started again. Night was coming on, and we neared our goal, the San Carlos Valley, where the largest river of East Falkland winds its way along, deep and rapid. On the other side sharp crests rise, and at their foot we sighted the settlement, San Carlos North, where we were received with the same kindness as ever. The next day we returned to Darwin. I was anxious to return to Stanley, but delayed my departure as long as possible, as I wanted to make an ascent of Mount Usborne, the highest mountain in East Falkland. But the rainy season would not come to an end, and finally I had to leave for the town. This time I took the route overland. I asked Halley if possible to climb the mountain and make some observations for me, and as he was able to fulfill his mission I had no reason to complain. The track to Port Stanley follows the southern slope of Wickham Heights. It is one of the very worst in the islands, especially after a long rain like the one we had experienced, and near the town stone runs appear with dangerous holes, covered by vegetation. We changed horses twice, and easily covered the distance, about 60 miles, in 2 days. Covered with mud and soaked to the skin, I rode into the town on February 1st. Only 12 days were left till the day when the mail steamer for Punta Arenas was due, and much work had still to be done. Amongst other things, I would not willingly leave the islands without paying a visit to Port Louis, where J.G. Anderson and myself had lived some time during the winter of 1902. Port Louis is the classical ground of the Falklands. Here lie the ruins of the old settlement. Here Charles Darwin strolled about. Here J.D. Hooker collected materials for his famous Flora Antarctica. Here the Challenger was anchored. All these memories crowd upon the mind of a naturalist of today and cast a halo round the brown, desolate heath. Several historic ruins are left in Port Louis. Here in 1764 the first settlement was established by the French. A few years later Spain took possession of it, but probably withdrew the garrison before 1780. In 1820 the captain of a vessel took possession of the islands for the government of Buenos Aires, but in 1833 a British man of war was sent to enforce England's rights, and since 1843 the Falklands have been constituted a crown colony. For further details I refer the reader to Darwin's journals, as well as to a paper read by the present governor, Mr. W. L. Allardyce, CMG, at the meeting of the Royal Colonial Institute, March 22, 1910. During the last days of our stay in Port Stanley everybody was walking about rife with expectation. A man of war, HMS Sappho, was due, and from the camp the young ladies came to the town prepared for a dance or a picnic. Some years ago a man of war used to be stationed in Stanley for several months every year, and opposite the town expensive constructions were made, a dock was built, and large coal sheds erected. But hardly was it ready when the whole scheme was abandoned, even the stationed vessel being withdrawn, much to the grief of the Stanley girls. At last the Sappho came, but by this time our period of rest had nearly elapsed. Halley returned from Darwin. We had to prepare our heavy luggage, and when the Oronza let her sonorous voice be heard, she found us ready. On February 12th, a bright summer day, the barren coasts of the Falkland Islands disappeared from our sight, perhaps forever. The big steamer hastened westward, and soon the lights at the Magellan Straits twinkled in the twilight. As we approached Punta Arenas, the sky shone bright red, and with the glasses we soon found out the reason. The forest south of the town was on fire. It made a mighty lighthouse that showed us the way to the roads, where we anchored at 1 a.m. on February 14th. Chapter 3. In Tierra del Fuego. In front of us stretches the long, yellow, sandy seashore, with slender jetties running far out into the shallow water. In the background rises the land, with forest-clad ridges and hills. Between the forests and the sea extends Punta Arenas, the town of the Magellan territories, a good type of mushroom city with a startling story of development behind it. In the last 10 years its population has greatly increased, and more than 12,000 people now have their home there, Chileans and Spaniards, Germans and Englishmen, Frenchmen and Italians, Swedes, Norwegians, Danes, Russians, Austrians, a babel of tongues. Pretentious stone buildings, interspersed with corrugated iron houses, dozens of hotels and American bars, howling gramophones, the rattling of cocktails in the mixing. That is the first impression. We take up our quarters in the traditional retreat for Swedish scientists, the Cosmos Hotel, a low, white plastered building on the sandy beach. We now found ourselves under changed conditions and with a starting point for our work where we knew nobody and where we had to do with authorities speaking a language not very familiar to us. I had almost expected that Quenzel would be back from his survey of the interior of South Patagonia, but there was not even a message from him. Neither had we received any reply from the Chilean government, and the entire future of our expedition would possibly depend upon their answer. So we started at once with short excursions in the neighborhood. Pally found a vast field for work in the coal mines in the narrow valley of Rio de las Minas. A few days after our arrival we had just returned home when our landlord, the ever-kindly and good-humored Bracco, told us that a Swedish gentleman had just arrived and wanted to make our acquaintance. Judge of my astonishment when we found him to be the highest representative of Sweden in Chile, Consul General A. Lowenborg, who had employed a short period of leisure in running down to Punta Arenas in order to welcome us and render us assistance in our dealings with the authorities. I know that if I now tell him that we shall never be able to thank him sufficiently for all he did for our expedition during its work in South America, or for the hearty personal friendship he showed us, I do not say too much. Now we could begin preparations for our first excursion in real earnest. The governor of the territory, Senor Chagno, received us with great courtesy, and Mr. Lowenborg brought the answer from the government that the naval station in Punta Arenas had already received orders to do everything possible to promote our success. The chief, Rear Admiral B. Rojas, put the small steamer Hummel at our disposal for the first voyage, to Admiralty Inlet, in Tierra del Fuego. These preparations having been made, we completed our party. We were sitting at the dinner table one evening when a wild, red-bearded camp man entered the dining room in the Cosmos. It was Quenzel, and we instantly followed him out to the courtyard, where his servant for the summer, the German Albert Pagels, was busy unsaddling the horses. In the most glowing terms they gave us a brief description of their travels in the most remote part of the South Patagonian Alps, so prolific in results that from that moment I longed to go there myself, but entertained little or no hope of being able to do so, as this lay beyond our original scheme. Now we could make ready. The horses were sent to a paddock, we bought hay, maize, and provisions, and looked over and completed our equipment. For once alone in a virgin country nothing could be procured. When I had discussed Pagel's qualifications with Quenzel, I engaged him for the trip, and asked him to bring another man with him, and as a result a fellow with the not particularly uncommon name of Muller joined our party. Now follows a hurry and a scurry and a sorting of half-packed boxes. Is nothing forgotten? The Hummel is waiting at one of the jetties, the last nails are driven into the lids of our boxes, and finally the cart jolts over the bumpy streets of Punta Arenas. All of us work like niggers, bags of maize, bales of hay, and boxes of all shapes and sizes are taken on board. Now only the most difficult affair is left, the embarkation of the horses. We tried various devices, but at last found that the only way was to use the derrick on the jetty. A lifebelt of special construction was employed, and wild with terror the animals were hauled swinging and kicking high up in the air, to land safe and sound on deck. We felt easy when all four had been transferred, but there was not much left of the limited deck space. As Punta Arenas is a town full of temptations, we went on board in the evening in order to be quite sure of getting off early the next morning. At daybreak, February 25th, our vessel left the roadstead. Our first visit was to Dawson Island, where the Roman Catholic Salesian mission station has long been established. They have partly converted the land into a sheep farm, with Indians as laborers. The station in Harris Bay is an imposing collection of buildings. We went on shore, and were very well received by the missionary, a stout and shining padre. He had already found time to send the boys to make themselves presentable, and they appeared in more or less queer dresses, but looking rather well brought up. Few of them were pure Indians. Mostly they betrayed a rather mixed origin, a fact perhaps somewhat remarkable at a mission station. Under the guidance of the missionary, we went round the place, inspecting the church bedecked with cheap finery, the school, the small sawmill, and so on. Certainly they have seen to it that the hitherto empty life of the natives shall find a real object and meaning. One thing, however, is of little account: the Indians themselves. According to what the bishop in Punta Arenas, Monsignor Fagnano, told me, there are only 45 in the station, most of them ONAs, but there are also some Yagans and a Lookaloo. The number is gradually diminishing. It is the old story: the natives are subdued or won over, put into clothes, forced to live in houses, and turned into laborers. In some cases perhaps their life gets easier, but with the kind of civilization imposed on them, absurd and more than shallow, there follow diseases and a misery unknown before. What the naked Indians can stand is too much for Indians in European clothes. They pine away and die in the true faith. But perhaps there dwells in the depths of their expiring souls a question never uttered. What have we done that we should be taken away from our land, that we should be exterminated from the face of earth? How many of them there are who really consider themselves indemnified by the liberal and, alas, cheap promises of a place in the special heaven of the church that rescued them? I cannot tell. But how men can imagine that by putting people whose mental life has proved to be so little developed and so utterly different from our own on the seats in church and in school, they can be got to grasp those intricate dogmas that have caused and still cause so much hatred and dissension amongst ourselves, that I confess myself unable to understand. I should, indeed, like to hear a religious dispute between a Lutheran and a Catholic Ona Indian. Today there is much spoken and written about the necessity of preserving natural scenery, rare animals, and sea. And all naturalists encourage the general tendency which has already evoked special laws in various states. But we seem to think more of remarkable animals than of human races. Could we not at least refrain from directly preventing the continued existence of interesting forms of Homo sapiens? Most of the male inhabitants of Dawson Island were away working in the camp, and we only saw some sick or feeble ones, who were seated outside their doors making Indian curiosities, to be sold by the missionaries in Punta Arenas. In a special house the women were occupied in spinning. The camera was familiar to them all, and with the aid of the missionary I was able to take a group, but it was more difficult to obtain permission to snap them in the costume of Adam. However, I managed to take photographs of an old married couple of Alukaloop, but they anxiously asked me not to show them to anybody. Kushki Shiku Turelik Scisc, my good fellow, your brown skin still glistened under the miserable rags you wore, besmeared as it was with stinking grease, that called forth old remembrances. Have you then forgotten that you are baptized and call yourself Brasido, and that it is strictly forbidden to practice such uncivilized customs? I asked them in Spanish, a language their tongues convert into a scarcely intelligible lingo, how their lives pleased them and where they came from. She comes from afar, the husband says, pointing to his wife. From the channels far west? She nods assent, and adds, there we were so many, and now, her voice expresses desperation and helplessness. All dead, all dead. But all round us in the forest dozens of images and pictures of saints bear witness to the triumph of Christian civilization. A fresh breeze met us when we steamed out of the Mission Bay, and the Humo rolled with might and main. Our horses had some very disagreeable hours. They were not far from falling overboard, or at least getting injured. After a short consultation we resolved to seek shelter from the rapidly increasing gale. There are very few harbors in Admiralty Inlet, and probably none better than Puerto Gomez, where we anchored, a true Fuegian cove, with the water-soaked virgin forest coming down to the water's edge, with steep, wooded ridges all round and snowy peaks in the background. The autumn scarcely shows its presence here, only the grass on the beach is more yellow than usual, but the forest itself stands as fresh and green as ever, even if the few flowers are still fewer. That day the winter sent us its first warnings, and we awoke to a splendid though hardly welcome sight. The summits shining white, the ridges powdered with snow, and a light cover on the branches of the evergreens down by the beach. But the squalls grew less frequent, the sun spread broader and broader golden stripes over the bank of clouds, and once more we tried our fortune afloat. Hallie and I inhaled this fresh atmosphere in deep draughts. The enviable Quenzel had just come from Pain, but we who saw only dirty colors in the Falklands thoroughly enjoyed the black mountains, the white snow, and the bluish ice of the glaciers. Farther and farther into the deep fjord we steamed, the mountains closed round us on each side, and in the innermost corner, called Hope Bay on the Admiralty chart, a pretty place where deciduous-leaved forest patches shimmer in the first crimson of autumn, the Hummel anchored. First we had to bring the horses ashore. Here luck helped us in a peculiar manner. Outside Dawson Island we found a lighter adrift, a runaway from Punta Arenas, and it came as though sent on purpose. The animals were lowered down from the davits, once more half dead with fright, but soon recovered when they found the good pasture along the shore. Our equipment was put in a heap on the shingle, and we set out to look for a comfortable camping place, and soon found an inviting corner on the edge of the wood. Instantly we pitched our tents and hoisted our little Swedish flag. At the request of our friend Captain Mayer we returned on board, had our dinner with the officers, and slept there. Early on the 28th the Hummel steamed out of the bay, hooted us a goodbye, and was soon out of sight. We were left to ourselves for a month, but we had not yet reached our goal. Towards the east we had to follow the valley of Rio Azapardo, and there, behind the woods, is the big lake, Lago Fagnano. The distance is only 8 miles, but these few miles have a very bad reputation. Some remarks on explorations prior to our own might be mentioned here. The first proper description of the lake and its surroundings we owe to the well-known Boundary Commission of Chile and Argentina, which finished its work here in 1895, and had then erected a cairn at each edge of the lake to indicate the boundary line. The members had also effected some boat journeys and had constructed a map. The natural history still remained unknown, and the Swedish expedition in 1896 under O. Nordenskjöld resolved to pay a visit to the big lake. He and his companions had their encampment not very far from ours, and we found some traces left by them and others of the Boundary Commission, especially a wooden corral, which we put in order and used ourselves. Nordenskjöld was only provided with food for a fortnight. He brought many people with him, and a rather big boat, intended for the navigation of the Rio Azapardo. This, however, proved impossible, and he was never able to make a camp on the lake. Accompanied by one man, he made an excursion on foot, crossed the valley of Rio Bedbetter, and saw from the slope of a mountain, probably Cerro Verde, that a pass over the main ridge, called Sierra Valdiviso on the Chilean map, very likely existed. The pass itself can hardly have been visible from the spot where he stood. Of the nature of the lake this expedition has very little to tell. Nordenskjöld alone got close to it. In October 1902, J.G. Anderson, well known as a member of the Swedish Antarctic expedition and the leader of its winter journeys, managed to reach the eastern end of the lake, using a road cut through the forest by the Brothers Bridges of Harborton, a track that united their vast camp at the Beagle Channel with that on the Atlantic coast. He brought a small canvas boat and made some zoological collections from the lake, but everything got lost in the shipwreck of the Antarctic in February 1903. Consequently, we had an open field for work, but time was valuable, as the winter might come any day. I think that autumn is the best season for traveling in the interior of Tierra del Fuego. Summer has dried the innumerable bogs and made them to some extent passable, and the rivers, that all come from the eternal ice and snow, do not carry as much water as they do earlier in the year. We set to work without a moment's delay. One of the officers on board the Hummel had told us that some of those indefatigable prospectors had left some sheep on a small island not far from our camp, and we sent paddles there with our canvas boat, on the Berthen system, which was now launched for the first time. Muller was left at the tents, and we started on foot up the Azapardo Valley in order to survey a suitable track for the horses. We only carried a couple of ship's biscuits each for provisions. The first mile did not look very bad. It was, however, impossible to follow the bank of the river, as it is covered by an almost impenetrable brushwood of Nothofagus antarctica, one of the Antarctic beaches, near. We followed the slopes of a mountain ridge south of the valley. Sometimes the ground seemed very dry and firm, sometimes we had to walk knee-deep through red and greenish-white peat moss. Now and then we came across a forest patch where we had a hard struggle with innumerable fallen trunks, marshy places, and thorny bushes. But we thought that an axe might open a way for horses, especially along the Guanaco tracks. Arriving at the top of a hill, we stopped in mute admiration. There between steep mountain chains we beheld for the first time Lago Fagnano in the far east, melting together with sky and mountains in a blue haze. It was still early in the day, and in spite of our meager supply of provisions we resolved to continue our march down to the lake. And we had good luck. We were just climbing the barranca of Rio Mascarello when we discovered a guanaco not more than 90 feet from us, grazing in unconscious security. We had not been observed, and a ball from our Winchester sent it into eternity. The meat was certainly very welcome. We had counted on living upon game, and had only brought some preserved meat for excursions. The big steaks were greeted with applause. One piece we put in a knapsack for dinner, and the rest was fixed on a tree out of reach of foxes and birds. The guanaco, Oceania guanaco, is closely related to the llama. When with straightened neck it slowly turns its small, elegant head, pricks up its ears, scenting danger, it makes a very pleasing impression of something at the same time strong, swift, and graceful. The nose is gray, the back covered with a reddish-brown wool, the throat and belly white. The thighs are red-brown, the legs white. Smaller or larger herds wander about in Tierra del Fuego and Patagonia, mostly on the pampas, but also at the edge of the forest zone on the slopes of the Cordillera, where green patches and rich alpine meadows are their favorite grounds. We had already passed several pantanos, peat bogs, with red, swelling tussocks sharply contrasting with the dark green forest patches, but we now came to that part of the valley where all the open spaces are filled with marshy ground. We could cross all right if we chose our way, but we had once realized that the horses would never follow our example. Here the forest gets still worse. The river runs close to the mountains, only leaving a very narrow space. To cut our way round bogs and forest higher up on the slope was not to be thought of, and further progress looked doubtful. But it was better here and there, and we felt hopeful till we came to the last mile. No horse would ever come through that. We should have to carry our own luggage. We stood on the shore of Lago Fagnano. This fact did not elate us unduly. It was simple enough to walk there, but the thought that we had reached our longed-for lake on the same day as we landed afforded us some amusement. With gathered driftwood we made a good fire and dried our clothes. Fixed on a stick, the guanaco meat soon became a regular asado that tasted very good, with a biscuit and water from the lake. A few yards from the shore we found a suitable place for the night in a grove of Nothofagus betuloides, coig, the evergreen Antarctic beech, and beautiful winter's bark, Drymes winteri, and we made our beds of fragrant branches round a roaring fire that sent showers of sparks through the dark night. The sky was clear and cold, but we maintained the fire and slept well for a while with the knapsack as pillow. We had not brought our sleeping bags. The ground was covered with hoar frost when at dawn we crept out of our nest. After eating the last piece of biscuit we walked back to our camp, keeping a desultory lookout for new tracks for the horses. How inviting the camp looks on our return. The tents shining white at the forest's edge, in the pots our dinner cooking with a cheerful sound, and at a little distance our horses grazing peacefully. Is there a truer sense of happiness and freedom than when the tent or the sky is your roof, the ground your bed, the campfire your hearth? In front of us, on the other side of the fjord, Mount Hope raises its jagged porphyritic mass, and icy crests peep forth behind it. The sun beams from a clear blue sky. It is still summer in Tierra del Fuego. Pagels had not seen any sheep, but had shot some kelp geese, Chloephaga hybrida, which, however, are generally considered as inedible. We had not been able to find our store of guanaco again when we returned from the lake, so, untroubled by a belief in the omniscience of authorities, we prepared the disdained geese and ate heartily of the dish. The first day of March was occupied by Halley and myself in a survey of the valley of Rio Fontaine, which discharges into Admiralty Inlet. Its nature closely resembles that of the Azapardo Valley. Quenzel and Pagels went to look for the guanaco meat and found it. In the evening we collected all the things to be brought up to the lake with the first transport, and at night everything was ready. One of the horses had been injured in landing, but the rest were saddled early the next morning, and the first caravan, under the direction of Quenzel, soon disappeared among the hills. The next day Halley and I made an ascent of a mountain behind our camp. The worst part of a Fuegian mountain is the forest belt, but sometimes one may get help from the winding paths of the guanacos. Thence one wanders free and happy over meadows adorned with flowers or across slopes of rattling stones, where small herds of guanacos with elegant tails gallop away, neighing merrily. From a summit we had a very fine view of the lake and the surrounding landscape. As we were studying it through the glasses we discovered some black specks at the bottom of the valley. The caravan coming back. 1, 2, 3 men, 1, 2, 3 horses. Good. At once we hastened down to the camp, anxious to hear their experiences, in which truly the trip had been rich enough. The track surveyed by us was of little use. The dry ridges where we had walked so hopefully were covered by peat, hardened on the surface, but not strong enough to carry the weight of a horse. Each horse had 9 times been bogged so badly that it had to be unloaded, dragged out of the peat, and loaded again, 27 times altogether. After 8 hours' desperate effort, a distance of 4 miles was covered, and the cargo had been deposited at the Mascarello River. Thus it was evident that we should have to carry all the luggage for the rest of the way. We hastily selected provisions for 15 days, packed our 8 feet collapsible berth in, and divided everything into 2 horse loads, as one of the horses had proved unfit for transport of that sort. The rest was put together in a depot, and early on the 5th we struck camp. We advanced slowly and without adventure till we had passed the first small tributary, when bad luck attended us. The horse with the boat and tents was badly bogged, capsized with his cargo, and lay groaning under the heavy load. To make matters worse, it happened on a steep slope, and we barely managed to save him from tumbling down into the river. Standing knee-deep in the loose peat, we unloaded him, turned him round, and got him on his feet again. He bled, but not very much. To give him the same load was impossible, as the ground grew worse still, but Muller and Pagels took the boat on their shoulders and continued the march. Now the horses had an easier march, but were of course bogged now and then. We dragged them across the worst places, one hauling at the cabresta, the 2 others walking by the side of the staggering animal supporting it. Nevertheless we got on, cheered the depot, and sent the horses back. I continued the way with our men, and we brought 3 loads up near to the lake. At nightfall we all gathered at Mascarello, and soon forgot our troubles round a mighty fire, although a treacherous trunk made me capsize the appetizing pea soup, just as we were ready to devour it with the appetites of lions. Another spell of impatient waiting was spent in discussions of what the coming day might have in store for us. We all felt that now the real hardships were about to begin. The loads were distributed in a very simple manner. Everybody took as much as he could carry, and a procession of 5 individuals started. Progress is not rapid, the steep riverbanks make our knees bend and our backs ache, the sun broils us, impudent flies torment us. The conversation is not very lively. Somebody throws his burden down, the others follow his example. We straighten our backs, wipe our brows with dirty shirt sleeves, and fall flat on the ground. Mechanically we chew a biscuit or a piece of chocolate. There is no time for dinner. Up again, through the thickets, where thorny bushes scratch our faces and bare arms, where every minute the load is caught in the dense branches, where moldering trunks trip us up. Through the bogs, where the oozing surface makes walking heavy work, through the ravines, where we must stop to drink the pure, cold water that comes directly from the melting snow. What delight when we catch a glimpse of the lake. With a sigh of relief we throw off our burdens on the shore. Here we found the boat and the flour bag left on the previous day, and we pulled round a cape and landed in a sheltered bay, called Expedition's Cove. We walked back again to Mascarello in order to make an early start the next morning. Some things were left there as a reserve depot, the rest we took on our shoulders and trod the same old wretched way again. Thus our camp at the lake became a reality. Our first destination was settled. The Swedish colors floated in the heart of Tierra del Fuego. The tent door is wide open. In most cases the chilly mornings tempt us to enjoy the warm comfort of the sleeping bag for another 5 minutes, but today it is not possible. Not a leaf moves. The lake lies shining like a mirror, only furrowed by a mated pair of podo vapors, steamer ducks or loggerheads, Tachyera cinereus, that glide away chattering merrily. The mountains on either side rise clear and sharp against the sky, one behind the other like gigantic wings. Close to us dark green with shades of red and violet, on the crests they gradually change into a bluish gray. In the background the rising sun over the water, a splendid white sun, promises us a magnificent day, sending us its greetings and illuminating every corner of our camp. Out from the bags, a speedy toilet, and as Pagels announces, porridge is ready. We gather round the cauldron. Round the fireplace we put some big logs as sofas, make ourselves comfortable, and with often repeated words of praise consume large quantities of oatmeal porridge and coffee with biscuits, and if 3 or 4 guanaco steaks should happen to go the same way, there is nothing to say against that. The work may be hard, but days like this make everything easy, mapping or geology or botany. The sunbeams play on the velvety moss carpet, with infectious laughter the stream falls down the precipice. Can any but bright faces gather round the fire when twilight falls over Lake Fagnano? Fixed on a stick over the embers our asado is roasted, delicious enough to make one's mouth water. The teapot sings, we light our pipes, This is the hour for stories. Pagels has an inexhaustible supply of stories from real life, for he has indeed seen a little of everything. What do you say to a fellow of 30, who has been sailor in the German Navy, bosun, sealer, gold digger, who has traversed half Patagonia on horseback, has smuggled troops into Central America, and assisted at the capture of Peking during the Boxer Rebellion? He was indispensable on our boat journeys, the type of Teutonic giant, used to all sorts of tricks on shore as well as on sea. Certainly he did not hide his light under a bushel. Sometimes he would make us half desperate with his patent dodges. He was always so absolutely sure that it wasn't worth while to try any other method than his, that there could not exist a better. Muller, with his pale face fringed with a big black beard, was more timid, but when he loosened his tongue we soon found him to be a rather well-read man, who was up to date in many things, especially in politics. He had arrived from Brazil, shook his head at the Fuegian weather and pulled his cap over his ears. After dinner, just when we are ready to go to bed, he puts his private kettle on the fire and the yerba or mate makes the round. Night has come. Prince, the expedition dog, is asleep with a guanaco bone, and the last embers show us our way to the tent. The first days we were very busy with detail work in the vicinity of our cove. Hallie made a map, Quenzel studied the geology, and I myself made botanical excursions, tried the boat, and took soundings in the western corner of the lake. But we could not put off the excursion to the Bedbetter Passage over the mountains, to which I have alluded before, and on March 10th we started, Quenzel, Pagels, and I in our knapsacks. We carried a pair of socks and provisions for 4 or 5 days. The sleeping bags were tied to the sacks. After a hard climb up the slippery slopes, sometimes on our hands and knees, we reached a ridge, but the view to the main Cordillera was still shut off by several summits. To the left there was no way, to the right was a peak sloping sheer down to piles of sharp-edged slate blocks. Pagels had hastened ahead, and shouted to us that he could see a way round the summit. With great care we groped round the precipitous wall, making use of fissures and narrow shelves that gave way under our weight, and after climbing some 100 feet more we finally reached the eternal snowfields at a height of about 3,000 feet. We stopped here a while in order to get an idea of our position and to make up our minds how to continue. The view was certainly splendid. All round us bright green alpine meadows, black debris or white snow, below the small characteristic valley basins, sometimes occupied by a small glacier or furrowed by icy brooks, surrounded by an emerald green moss carpet and the last flowers of autumn. If we compare the alpine flora of Tierra del Fuego with, for instance, that of Europe, the former without doubt is left far behind, but nevertheless it has the same peculiar stamp, the same gay colors. Our looks sweep over the plateaus. Not far from us our destination, Sierra Valdiviso, rises, and in the distance the summits of Darwin Mountains, one of the highest parts of Tierra del Fuego, shine like diamonds. Silence and desolation reign over this height. Only a single guanaco neighs and takes to flight, and a condor majestically soars over our heads. As to the direction in which we should find the pass, the maps had misled us. We had made a long detour and the day's labor had partly been thrown away. We were forced to climb down into the Bedbetter Valley and follow it up to the pass. Without hesitation we left the mountains and dived into the brushwood. I think that we shall not easily forget this expedition. The tough branches clung round legs and arms, and only after we had lost our patience did we really make any progress. The mountain wall falls off nearly at right angles. When the hands grasped for the branches the legs touched the heads of other trees beneath, and more like monkeys than human beings, dirty and soaked, we reached the yellowish-brown bogs in the valley. We found a dry hillock with a nice carpet of diddledy, impetrum rubrum, and spread out our sleeping bags there. The night was chilly, but we awoke to another fine day, and porridge and coffee soon put new life into us. The way was always more or less wretched. Several streams with ice-cold water were crossed without ceremony. We emptied our boots, wrung our socks out, put them on again, and were all right. Some stretches were covered by tall forests of roble, down here Nothofagus pumilio. Several times we crossed the Rio Bedbetter, making use of fallen trunks as natural bridges. By and by we climbed upwards with the valley, and soon beheld a beautiful mountain, called by us Cerro Svea, most interesting as differing widely in geological features from the surrounding country. The river disappeared in a deep gorge, but we struck it again, and were able to follow it with the eyes up to a glacier with beautiful edge moraines on Mount Svea, whence most of the water comes. We crossed the river for the last time, worked our way through the belt of brushwood, and found an open space big enough for our bags and comparatively dry. As we had 3 hours left before nightfall, Quenzel and I had once climbed the ridge behind us in order to look for the pass. Being hard up for meat, we had brought the Winchester, and came across a small herd of guanacos at a height of about 2,500 feet. They were too far off, and we started to stalk them. Perhaps we should have been successful had not the mountain fog, thick and impenetrable, come down upon us, and with it a snowstorm. From a crest at about 3,300 feet we saw the herd hurry away down towards the valley on the other side of the pass. But we had also seen something else before the foggy wall shut out everything round us. Beneath our feet stretched an unknown valley, red, brown, and yellow like the Bedbetter Valley, and in numerous serpentines a river wound through the peat bogs, coming from the glaciers on the south side of Mount Svea, while in a side valley we perceived a small mountain lake that discharged into the river. Then the curtain fell, violent snow squalls forced us to return, and, groping in the debris, half blind with the snow, we came down to the fire with the night. Snow continued to fall, but supper tasted better than ever, and the flakes quickly melted in the hot cocoa. Later the sky cleared, cross and centaur glittered. "We'll have a dry night," we said, and crept into the bags. It was a strange awakening. Certainly I had felt, half asleep, that the bag was growing heavier and that water was trickling in from the pillow, my coat and trousers, but I shook off the snow, pulled the hood tighter round my head and slept again. I jumped up on hearing Pagel's Aber, Herr Doktor, and looked round. The landscape had changed. Certainly Mount Svea had been white and glistening before, but now, here was winter. All round us everything was white and clean. The sleeping bag was covered 2 inches deep, more or less, our boots had disappeared, our clothes were soaked. It was not especially agreeable to put them on, but there was no help for it. The fire half dried us, and then we had breakfast. The sky is blue, the sun is already melting the snow, no time must be lost. Pagels was sent to shoot a guanaco. Prince had not had anything to eat since we left Lake Fagnano. Quenzel and I walked to the pass and down along the slopes of the new valley. The river we named Rio Rojas, after the admiral in Punta Arenas. It is the same river that discharges into Lake Asagami near the Beagle Channel. The new lake was named Laguna Lowenborg. Probably we were the first white men here. We have been told that in old times Indians used to cross the mountains from Azapardo to the Beagle Channel, but we do not know if this be true or not. If so, they would have used our pass, Paso de las Lagunas, as we call it. Its height above sea level is about 2,100 feet. It was a matter of some disappointment that we did not see the Beagle Channel. Pagels had followed the other side of the valley, climbed a peak, and saw from there 2 sheets of water. To judge from his description, one of them was Yendigaya, the other the Beagle Channel itself. Moreover, he brought back the best pieces of 2 guanacos, and Prince could hardly walk back to the camp, so much had he devoured. The weather had changed once more. It did not snow, but rained hard instead. However, we resolved to stop one day more, provided that the sky was clear enough. The next day opened with mist and rain, so we could do nothing but return. It did not matter much that the rain poured down. We were as wet as we could possibly be, and only the interior of our sleeping bags was still dry. It was not easy to find a dry spot for the night's camp, and still less easy to make a fire. But after an hour's work we had a nice blaze. It rained all night and all the next day, but we went on. The forest seemed denser than ever, the streams were swollen and rapid, and we felt it a relief to wade through the open bogs along Rio Bedbetter down to the lake. In the camp everything was in perfect order. Halley was ready to undertake the proposed trip across the mountains north of Fagnano and down to Lake Deseado, and accompanied by Muller he set out over the lake to a suitable starting place. Pagels and I were busy preparing for a boat trip, and early on the 16th we loaded the cargo. When everything was on board, the rifle, provisions, sounding lines, nets, sleeping bags, and sea, we had so little room left for ourselves that we had to sit very uncomfortably. From the shore we had seen some small islands. We set our course for them, and found them interesting enough, as they showed beautiful traces of the glacial age in the form of moraines, erratic blocks, and polished stones. The direction of the morainic ridges and the origin of the blocks showed to a certainty that the ice had moved west-eastward here. Later in the day I found new proofs, and with regard to plant geography, a subject I desired to study more specially, I had a rare chance of following step by step the gradual change of evergreen into deciduous forest. At 3 p.m. we passed the remnants of a cairn with a tripod of rough sticks on the top of it. We were now in Argentina. Now and then an inquisitive guanaco looked at us from the forest's edge, but soon withdrew, and flocks of screaming parakeets flew among the heads of the roble trees. But no trace whatever of Ona Indians was to be seen. A small forest-clad island appeared to us a suitable camping place, and at nightfall we landed with great care. Good luck was almost necessary for us. Only for a few days in the month is Lake Fagnano calm. Generally a fresh westerly breeze keeps up a heavy sea. The lake is about 56 miles long, and we had now covered 1/4 of that distance. Another nice day and we should have done our work. Through the canvas and blanket I heard a soft murmur, only a little breeze, and we breakfasted with strong hopes for a good day. But we were greatly deceived. The wind increased, and when we finished our meal there were already white crests on the billows. The sky promised a gale, but as we did not want to be idle we pulled across to the shore, where we strolled about along the beach. We returned at the last moment and got some water in before we reached our island. I had plenty of time to survey our position. Seldom was the impression of virgin ground so strong as here. No guanacos ever come there. The grass is never grazed upon, but grows in enormous beds where one sinks down to the knees through piles of dry blades. Several plants that were quite familiar to me in other places here grew to a gigantic size and were hardly to be recognized. What a difference between this place and the Azapardo Valley. We are in the zone of the roble. The dense, dark green groves with the thick, water-soaked carpet of mosses and liverworts has disappeared. So has also canelo, or winter's bark, one of Flora's most beautiful children in the far south. The forest is dry, the green colors bright, dry as the moss carpet, and out of the thick layer of fallen leaves slender forest herbs peep forth. Our island is a little paradise, but nevertheless we want to take leave of it as soon as possible. All day passed, and all night it blew hard enough to make the big trees wave and groan. In the morning the sea ran as heavy as before. The situation became still less pleasant. The next day we expected Halley back, and he could not reach the tents without a boat. Our provisions were almost finished, and we found nothing to shoot. We looked for berries, and found calafate, Berberis buxifolia, and chora, Pernitia mucronata. We had also some biscuits left. Suddenly the wind died away. It was already late, 5 p.m., but we did not linger a moment, loaded the boat and left the island. Our little nutshell quite disappeared in the troughs of the waves. We could not go further east. Probably the next day would bring us a strong headwind on our return. We crossed the lake and were just close to the northern shore when we caught sight of a tiny column of smoke rising out of the forest. Indians, some of the last families still living the old life. However, we could not stop, but preferred to take advantage of the fine weather. The night was very dark. We made only one halt, at a place where Indians had had their camp long ago, as the guanaco bones gave evidence. On our return we sounded and got our greatest depth, 70 fathoms, close to the island. A series of soundings show that the bottom slopes gradually to the east. The deepest part is probably west of the middle. Early in the morning we were back home, where Quetzal and Prince received us. Halley had not shown any sign of return, but his signal came later in the day, and Pagels was sent with the boat to fetch him. He had penetrated to the mountains north of Lake Deseado. No natives were seen, but otherwise he had had a bad time. The comparisons Muller made between Brazil and Tierra del Fuego were not in favor of the last mentioned country. We had reason to be contented that we were all back, for the same day a storm came on, the end of which we hardly saw. The last excursions were done with the rain pouring down. The Hummel was expected on the 25th, and 3 days earlier we struck camp. The cargo was, of course, not so large, no provisions were left, and, besides, Pagels undertook to pull the boat with some less fragile things down Rio Azapardo, in spite of the rapids. Quetzal had to follow alongside the river and give Pagels a hand with the landings. The rest of us divided what was left of our equipment and set out. I believe we never worked so hard before. I shall not try the reader's patience with another detailed description. Let it be sufficient to remark that the bogs were frightful after the severe rainfalls, that we were often stuck, while a never-ceasing rain increased the weight of our load at every minute. Soaked to the skin and without the possibility of getting dry clothes, we reached the depot at Mascarello, and after a while Pagels and Quetzal also came in. They had managed their business well enough. Only once the boat had struck a rock in one of the rapids and filled with water, and some things belonging to the cargo were carried away forever by the current. But Pagels reached the shore before the little craft sank. They told us that the boat was on the shore at the foot of a barranca, where it would be impossible to pull through the cañon, as the place must be described as really dangerous. As the barranca was very steep they could not carry the boat without help, so we all went to the river, and found the place so steep that we had to slide down to the water, grasping the roots of the trees or whatever else we could get hold of. We transported everything past the rapids, and managed to fix the boat behind some bushes that kept it from falling into the river, and the other things were hidden as well as we could hide them. But evidently we had not been careful enough, for when our sailors returned the following day they missed several things, amongst them all our supply of meat. Clearly the foxes had been there and done good business. Hallie and I made no haste, but waited till the rain had ceased a little, packed our cargo, and waded through the clay down the river. But there we stopped. Was this our old innocent Mascarello? A yellowish stream whirled along the stony, invisible bed. I tried to cross, but close to the shore the water reached high upon my thighs, so we could not venture with our heavy cargo in the rapid current. We waited a while, and divided the last piece of meat between us. Only a few handfuls of flour were left of the provisions, and I resolved to risk baking it in the frying pan. I made proper dough with some baking powder, greased the pan with the last dirty grease left, put a lid on, and covered it with hot cinders. We waited anxiously, but when I appeared with delicious bread my triumph was complete. It tasted excellent. In vain we surveyed the river down to its junction with Rio Azapardo. Nowhere did we find a place where we could cross it, and we had to stop another night in our wet clothes. It rained all the time, but we were happy to get a cold morning that made the water level in these glacier streams sink rapidly. We crossed without delay, the rain ceased, and a fresh gale soon dried our clothes. We could hardly recognize our old place at Hope Bay. The forest was changed into a swamp, and the beautiful open space where we had pitched the tents was a lake. The taste of the water plainly showed that the sea too had penetrated hither during our absence. Luckily enough we had placed our depot above this unsuspected flood. We soon found a new place. Hallie and I, who arrived first, at once set to work to pitch the tents, when suddenly a signal announced the arrival of the Hummel. The officers came ashore, anxious to get news. We could not promise to be ready that same day, there being still things left in the depot at Mascarello. Quenzel and Pagels arrived with the boat. Muller, who had fallen behind, and, according to his custom, also got lost, finally appeared, and we were gathered round the fire occupied in devouring the delicacies left in the depot when a message came from the Hummel telling us that she had damaged her engines and wanted to repair. As Hope Bay is anything but sheltered, she had to leave us once more, but the captain promised to be back on the 26th. He went to Puerto Gomez. We were very glad to get another day, as the horses only came halfway to Mascarello, and for the rest the things left there had to be carried. In due time the Hummel arrived. Well-known dark clouds appeared on the sky, and made us hurry up as much as possible. The horses had to swim, and 2 of them came on board quite exhausted. And we did not embark without adventure. We were just on our way to the ship with a large, heavy boat, the cargo being so bulky that only 2 oars could be used, when suddenly a heavy squall came on. We were 10 minutes off from the vessel, but were driven back in spite of our energetic efforts, and almost before we knew it we were among the breakers on the shore. We had no choice. We jumped into the water, passed the things along, and pulled up the boat. On board they grew anxious and blew the whistle, but we could do nothing but wait. At last we took an opportunity between 2 squalls. Standing in the water to our waists we loaded the boat, got out of the heavy surf, and came on board. But we were so delayed that we stopped the night where we were. On March 27th we saluted Hope Bay and proceeded westward, but did not get out of the inlet. A headwind and a heavy sea showed us that it would be too much for our poor horses, so we sought shelter once more in Puerto Gomez. Here a little scene happened that I often recall to memory and will not keep from my readers. In Punta Arenas the cabin boy had smuggled on board some nasty stuff, I believe absinthe, which is strictly prohibited, and his friend the cook had got drunk. The captain tried and sentenced them without hesitation. They had to undress, and were thrown into the sea with a rope round the waist. In the ice-cold water they had an opportunity of repenting of their sins. This method was said to be as effective as it is simple. From Puerto Gomez we went straight to Punta Arenas, where we arrived on the 28th, and at once started to prepare for the next trip. Chapter 4. Otway Water and Skyring Water. During the Swedish South Polar Expedition of 1901 to 1903 the question of surveying the Great Otway and Skyring Waters also had been discussed, but we could not proceed further. At that time the inner part of Skyring was completely unknown, and, as it later became evident, a geographical discovery of great importance was in store. Already, before the outburst of the Great Peruvian War, 1879, the Chilean government had started a survey, but the war put a stop to all work of that kind, and it happened that a long period elapsed before a new investigation was undertaken. Not until 1902 did we get news from Skyring. Then, however, Captain Ismael Gajardo discovered the channel later named in his honor, a channel which unites Skyring water with a bay from the Magellan Straits, the Zultegua Gulf. Thus the white spot began to disappear, and in 1905 the government published a new Admiralty chart of Otway and Skyring. But many scientific problems awaited solution, and, as far as we could, we wanted to contribute towards it. I submitted a scheme to Admiral Rojas, and, having gained his approval, we prepared for the new excursion. We were to use the same vessel, the Hummel, commanded by L. Diaz Palacios, captain in the Navy. We engaged paddles for this trip also. On April 11th, we steamed out into the Straits. As a period of storm had prevailed for some days, we got a very heavy sea, which made the small ship roll in a most perilous manner. The clinometer indicated 33 degrees, and I believe one seldom gets more. We remained on deck, enjoying the grand spectacle of a turbulent sea. At nightfall we reached the San Isidro lighthouse, one of the very few down here. The morning was bright, and we weighed anchor early, but had not proceeded many miles before the storm recommenced. We could not venture to pass Cape Froward, but had to seek a harbor, where we stopped all day. Cape Froward, or Forward, is the southernmost point of the American continent. Here the heavy seas from the Strait and from Magdalena Channel meet, and here, too, is the limit between the April weather of the east and the west's rainy mist, dense as a wall. The point also is of appropriate shape, it lies like a big clenched fist. Next day we rounded the cape and entered Jerome Channel, connecting Otway water and the Straits. It is very grand scenery, and if you look at the west shore you will believe that you are in the western channels, with their high mountains, dark forest patches ending in snowfields, fine cascades, and waters, black and deep, close to the cliff. Our first station was Cutter Cove, where several years ago was found copper ore in considerable quantities, to work which a company was formed. Here we got a good idea of a rather tragic chapter of Patagonian history. Prospectors and mining engineers, often without the slightest right to such a title, collected like flies on a piece of sugar. Every day new people had mining claims granted to them. The deposits were described in glowing terms. At once people in America or Europe formed companies, sometimes with a big joint capital. The gold fever raged, and it was taken for granted that immense riches must exist in Patagonia. Engines and machinery were bought, houses built, and then the end came. For as soon as work was started one or another disagreeable discovery was made. The quantity of ore was too small, the quality inferior, or the methods unsuitable, and the company failed. Speaking of claims, I cannot help telling the following story. When we went to Admiralty Inlet, and the newspapers in Punta Arenas reported the fact, a poor fellow who had once prospected for gold there laid claim to a big piece of land, evidently dreading that we should get sight of his sleeping millions. The day after our departure his claims were published. Heaven knows what he had not found in the way of valuable things down there, all carefully enumerated. We do not envy him, however, for there was absolutely nothing there to speak of. After having visited some places on the south side of Otway water, we crossed it in order to follow the north shore. The land here gradually rises towards the interior of Riesco Island. The slopes are clad with tall forests. In the south part it is covered by the evergreen trees that by and by are mingled with the light green roble, Nothofagus pumilio, which reigns alone for a short stretch. Where the water narrows to Fitzroy Channel the country once more changes its nature, and we are on the edge of the Patagonian pampa, where groves of N. Antarctica form a brushwood. Of course these changes depend upon the climatic conditions, especially the decreasing rainfall. At several places we saw traces of habitation. In one little snug harbor, surrounded by a beautiful forest, full of screaming paroquets, and with the wild fuchsia, F. Magellanica, still in bloom, was a small abandoned sawmill. At another place we saw human beings, who fled as soon as they caught sight of us. They must have had some reason to hide, and probably the uniforms of our naval officers frightened them. On April 16th we anchored at the entrance to Fitzroy Channel, connecting Otway and Skyring. It is a very narrow, shallow, and crooked passage, through which the tide rushes at a great speed. The passage entails innumerable changes of direction, soundings, and great caution. The shores are flat. We have entered the Pampa zone, and find the outposts of civilization on both sides. Los Amigos, where we had the doubtful pleasure of staying longer than we wished, can boast of 2 hotels, stores, an American bar, and a billiard saloon. We had some work to do there, as we made an interesting discovery of stratified clay from the glacial age, but when we were ready to leave, Skyring was not at all willing to welcome us, to judge from the southwesterly gale, which caused us to drag anchor more than once. We made an attempt to enter the open water, but encountered some heavy seas that swept the whole vessel and led us to turn back. You must not forget that the Hummel only boasts 180 tons. Not until the 22nd could we repeat the attempt. The waves still swept over the decks, but the north coast afforded some shelter, and we cast anchor in Puerto Altamirano. We had gone westward again and back to the forest. Here lives the pioneer who has penetrated furthest west, a Frenchman, M. Guyon, in his lonely blockhouse. Here he has lived several years with his wife and his children, some hundreds of sheep, some cows and hens. The house looked poor, but clean, and the mistress made some nice coffee and showed us all the kindness she could, insisted on our taking the last raspberries in the garden, and finally made us a present of a fine head of cauliflower. Happy, contented people, we pressed their hands warmly when we said, "Good night," to them and "Goodbye," to houses and people. All traces of man have not disappeared, though they present themselves in a different way. It is a bright morning when we come pulling towards Isla Escarpada, i.e., the precipitous island, to look for a place to land. And lo, the cliff opens, we glide into a charming cove, where the waves break softly on the fine white sand, and on the shore is a confusion of green winter's bark, rich in foliage, and high-stemmed beeches, clothed with tiny mosses and thin, elegant hymenophyllums, thickets of fuchsia and large fronded ferns. In this peaceful paradise stood the skeletons of 2 Indian huts. Shells, bones of seals and birds proved that they had been inhabited not long ago. Could we only have called up the wretched brown figures, the picture would have been complete. This encounter with natives' work put us in a reflective mood. Here was a nature, still virgin, with man as one of her numerous beings, not as the absolute master, and here we stood, members of the white race which makes all originality vanish under its hands. The landscape in the west part of Skyring has a great deal in common with the famous Patagonian channels. Everywhere long, narrow inlets penetrate far into the Cordilleras. Some of them are extremely beautiful and exhibit the true fjord nature, with the entrance barred by a threshold and deep water inside, but the steamer cannot enter, and one has to pull in small yawls. For the most part the scenery is perhaps more somber than grand. Generally heavy clouds rest on the black, splintered crests, so heavy that even the ice fields lose their whiteness. The reddish bogs and the deep, dark forest patches, which cling to the steep cliffs and get thicker and closer towards the sea, becoming a solid, impenetrable covering to everything down to the water itself, make a solemn impression. You hardly hear a bird sing or an insect hum, but even here nature may smile, when the sun rises over precipitous summits that stand clear against the sky, and paints the forest with light green bands and the snowfields with pink. Or when the midday light is reflected with the splendor of diamonds from the glaciers, where caverns and cracks gleam with that magnificent blue color, varying from deep cobalt to light ultramarine. Then you also notice all the more minute details in the forest, that you hardly pay any attention to when the rain is pouring down and fog is on the water. I do not speak as a botanist now, for I naturally found the forest as interesting in the bad weather, and I had every reason to rejoice at the results of my studies in Skyring. The geologists also were contented. They got a natural section through the mountains, older layers appearing as one proceeds westwards. We still hoped to meet Indians. In many places we found abandoned huts, but never the natives. We had heard of a passage made by Indians from Excelsior Inlet to Obstruction Sound, and spent a day visiting it. The inlet is barred and the ship had to stop outside. We found the way, but I shall tell of it in another connection. Estero de los Ventisqueros, the glacier inlet, is one of the longest and most narrow, penetrating south-southwest far into the Muñoz Gamero Peninsula. Its innermost part was hardly known, which gave us a special reason for going there. The entrance is very narrow, and has the character of a rapid stream. Up it we forced our way between stones and heavy logs. The stream seemed to us somewhat strange, and we were not surprised to find the water in the inlet fresh, a lake having been formed where the tide played no part. Between imposing mountains, clad with snow and glaciers, we pulled towards the end, round a point that has shut off the interior, where was the gigantic glacier, stretching a tongue out into the water, which is full of ice. The ice wall is about half a mile broad, and has a height of about 90 feet. We spent some hours here collecting, and late in the evening came back on board very pleased with our day and anxiously waiting for the next, when we were to make the acquaintance of Gajardo Channel. The outer part produced the same impression as the other inlets we had seen, but it gradually became very narrow, and finally no passage could be found. We had reached the place called Angostura de los Tempanos, or Iceflow Narrows, where even rowing boats can hardly pass. Here the tidal current rushes through a narrow gorge over stones and reefs at a speed of up to 8 knots. Heaps of ice from the surrounding glaciers are brought to and fro through the narrows, and have given rise to its geographical name. The Hummel anchored close to the cliff, a boat was lowered, and we set out to pull through. We had the tide against us, though not with its full force, and hardly got away from the spot in spite of 8 men at the 4 oars. At great risk we got past the whirlpools round the shallow places. Excitement could be read in all faces, and with loud hurrahs, we came out into calmer water. To our right a small inlet opened, and as we rounded the point the sight of the glacier in the background called forth renewed cheers. I think I have seen much ice in all shapes and forms, but hardly anything that made so strong an impression on me. In frozen cascades it comes through a narrow chasm, broadens out again, and protrudes into the green, transparent water with a tongue 100 feet high, crowned by millions of fantastic needles. Hardly a fleck on it, but what a play of bright colors, Prussian blue, ultramarine, and cobalt. In silence we rested on the oars, watching the sight. There was a narrow crevice in the rock at the edge of the ice where we could land. On one side we had the glacier, on the other the high ice-clad cliff. Huge pieces had fallen down where we now stood. As the place looked dangerous, we hurried on with our observations. Now and again the big glacier discharged large pieces of ice, giving rise to a swell that made our position uncomfortable. Quenzel got specimens of the rocks. Hallie and I found some alpine plants that thrive at sea level, refreshed by the cool breath from the icy surroundings. We had just left when with thunder a large ice block plunged down into the water, followed by a wave so great that an accident might easily have happened had we remained there. The place was swept by water and pieces of ice, and we had trouble enough to keep the boat clear from the rock where we landed to watch the imposing spectacle. As we did not want to stop with the ship near the Narrows, the anchorage being miserable, we resolved to go back. Pulling along the cliff, where a hanging glacier looked down on us from above, happily enough without paying us any other attention, we arrived at the critical place, and beheld a sight not particularly encouraging. Our calculations had failed. The current had turned and rushed full speed in the opposite direction, playing with the ice floes that were on their way to the other side of the pass. We tried, but were caught by a whirlpool, and were only saved by the efforts of the oarsmen from being crushed against the rocks. We crossed and landed on the east side, and climbed the rocks to look at the surroundings. On the other side it was not possible to get along. On this we could certainly pass if we kept at a height of 30 to 50 feet above the water. We should thus be able to get down on the north side and signal to the ship. But the boat? We could not leave it there. We had almost made up our minds to wait 5 or 6 hours when Pagels made a suggestion. He thought it possible, though dangerous, to climb along the precipice, dragging the boat by the painter, which was rather long. Step by step we advanced. It was not easy to find foothold. The tiniest shelf was taken advantage of. Our fingers grasped the smallest irregularities on the face of the high, precipitous cliff. The boat seemed to cling to every irregularity or projection. The current pressed it against the cliff with such force that some of us had to jump into it, cutting our fingers in trying to fend it off. We got past the worst rapids and gained a place where the mountain sloped gradually down to the water. Another critical moment. We all embarked, only Pagels, firmly squatted on his broad hams, pipe in mouth, still grasped the painter. Ready with the oars, Pagels swung the bow round, jumped into the boat, and at the same instant 4 oars dipped and strained against the current. The least carelessness and the boat would have been hurled back into the rapids again. A last effort, making the oarsmen drip with sweat in spite of the cold weather, and we were back on board. It was too late to look for a new anchorage. We lay in a very disagreeable and rather unsafe place, the bottom being rock and the water deep close to the shore, where several shoals unexpectedly appeared. Now and then a strong puff of wind came from the high mountains, giving us a foretaste of the weather we should get. We had hardly got on board when the ship went adrift. Hastily we got sufficient pressure in the boilers to heave up and anchor again. There was not much repose on board that night. It was pitch dark, the channel narrow, the current strong, and the shore dangerous. The captain had thrown himself on a sofa with his clothes on, and we were disturbed by heavy boots tramping over our heads, and every 10 minutes soundings were taken in order to see if we were drifting. At 5 a.m. I heard the noise of heavy squalls, and noticed that the vessel trembled in a curious manner, as if she were aground. I fell asleep once more, but woke up with the engines working at full speed and the hull shaking terribly. I was right. We had dragged anchor and struck a flat rock, not more than 100 feet from the shore. With the engines alone we made no progress, but we tried a kedge with better result. Nothing serious had happened, and in the gray dawn we steamed out of Gajardo Channel. A few words on the peculiar hydrographic and biological conditions in Skyring water might be of some interest. As the narrow and shallow Fitzroy and Gajardo channels are its only connection with other water, the tide is hardly noticeable, the difference being only some few inches. From glaciers and rivers volumes of fresh water are discharged into Skyring, and the result is brackish water. That the organic life is influenced thereby is evident. The plant life is different, seaweeds are miserable, no big kelp is found, and animal life is very poor. In the central and east part of the large water several landings were left, and we crossed from north to south and vice versa a number of times. The country further east has nothing of the wild beauty of the west, but is not less interesting. The tertiary layers were surveyed by Halley at two places, Mina Magdalena and Mina Marta. On the last mentioned place you may see a Patagonian mining enterprise in its last stage, ruined houses, rusty machinery strewn all over the ground. The coal was no coal, which the engineers did not discover till everything was ready for a start, but lignite, whose value may be scientific, but hardly more. Halley found plenty of fossils. When we came back to Los Amigos we wanted to make some additional excursions in Otway water, but unhappily there is a telephone line to Punta Arenas, and the Admiral requested us to return as soon as we could. This made us pass Jerome Channel at night. The captain did not like it, but he had been asked to do it, if possible. We were not very pleased at returning so soon. It was a fine evening, we had crossed Otway water, and the Hummel made its way along the coast of the Jerome Channel, where mountain and water merge into black darkness. We were approaching the outlet, when the engine suddenly stopped. The current is in our favor, thus giving us a moment's breathing space. What's the matter? The engineer does not know. Something has gone wrong. He cannot risk going any further. But we shall drift ashore within a minute or two, the captain shouts. We must continue. Again we try, very slowly. A noise of thunder is heard from the big cylinder, as if the cap would burst. A conference is held. We cannot reach a safe harbor. The nearest is Arouse Bay, but the water is dirty there, and it is not sheltered from the prevailing wind. However, we try again, and being outside the harbor a yawl is sent ahead to make soundings, and by means of fire signals the officer in it leads us to an anchorage. The damage proved to be very serious. We had broken the shaft, and there could be no thought of repairing it here. All we could do was to keep it tight till we could reach Punta Arenas. Good luck had helped us hitherto. Had it happened half an hour earlier we might have lost the ship, but we still wanted a good deal. The bay is open to the southwest. If a gale comes now, when our fires are out, what can we do? We had good luck. All the time the rare north wind blew. After working without a moment's stop for 30 hours the clever engineer declared all to be ready, and on the evening of May 4th we were back in Punta Arenas again. Thank you for listening to part 1 of The Wilds of Patagonia by Carl Skottsberg. If you enjoyed so far, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss when the next part is released. We'll continue the journey in part 2. See you there.